Hi guys and girls, I'm Obsidian and welcome back to Elite Dangerous. The Elite Dangerous Wiki tells us that since launch on December 16th, 2014, there have been 7,563 documented improvements to the live game via 66 client server and 25 supplementary server updates. But in real terms, what does this mean? When I look at my comments section, and even more so when I look at the official Elite Dangerous forums, I often see a lot of opinions that express the feeling that Elite really hasn't changed that much over the years. So let's talk about that, because it's certainly relevant, but is it valid? So this isn't going to be an exhaustive list of every change ever introduced into the game, as I'm certainly not going to be reading out years worth of patch notes. Instead, I will take a look at the most, but maybe not all, of the major updates released since day one. But before we get to that, let's take a look at Elite Dangerous as it was released in December of 2014. Keep in mind that I won't be talking about the alpha or beta phases here, because those are pre-release. Version 1.0 of Elite Dangerous then was both at the same time a stunning affair, but also to some degree underwhelming. During the lead up to release, many players believed that the beta and then the so-called gamma phases were to be a vertical slice of what would ultimately be released. That is to say, people believed that the final 1.0 version would contain far more content than the final test version that they had already been playing. Whilst certainly not everyone believed this, far from it in fact, it was a widely circulated belief on the official forums, and Frontier never did anything to dispel it. However, the final 1.0 release was, to all intents and purposes, the same as the final test release. But this wasn't necessarily a bad thing, aside from perhaps to those who had extremely high and unrealistic expectations. Version 1.0 featured the entire Milky Way, tens of thousands of space stations, and a contingency of ships, which also included a single large ship, the Anaconda. Naturally, on release, earning credits was extremely difficult, with bounties paying out in the hundreds, and if you were lucky, in the thousands. This was offset against high ammo and fuel costs. Keep in mind that there was no engineering at this point, so the game meta was very different. However, the fundamentals of the game were in place. Players could use the mission board, which was then called the bulletin board. It was also possible to go bounty hunting or do some mining. Trading also worked. In short, the basic gameplay loops we have today existed in pretty much the same form in December of 2014. The first major update came fairly quickly in February of 2015, less than 2 months after the game's release. This was update 1.1 called Community Goals, and introduced what was to become a long-standing game mechanic. The galaxy map route plotting was also extended to 1000 light years, at this point having previously been limited to 100 light years all the time before, so a very nice quality of life improvement. There were a few other additions, but the highlight really was the community goals. The next update, Wings, arrived a month later on the 10th of March 2015. At this point, players were getting used to a rapid release cycle. Wings introduced group play, allowing players to form into wings, essentially 4 players banded together as a single group. This update, however, didn't include wing missions, or indeed any other activity for players to do as a group. Instead, players were expected to continue playing under the previous solo player focused game loops. The update also introduced 2 new ships, the FDL and the Vulture, plus, for the first time, the ability to use an external camera. The much derided Powerplay was released in June of 2015. Now this was widely expected to introduce new gameplay loops into Elite, and after a fashion it kind of did achieve that. Yet to this day it's still unclear just how many players actually get involved with Powerplay, but it's fair to say that there are a good number of players who actively enjoy it. It's also equally fair to say that there's a whole lot of players who completely ignore it. Powerplay, though, put a face on characters within the Elite Dangerous galaxy. At this point, there were still no in-game avatars. This meant players all wore the same faceless mask, and NPCs didn't have an image anywhere within the game. Powerplay addressed this, at least to a limited extent, by introducing a number of portraits for the Powerplay leaders. The Imperial Courier, Diamondback Scout, and Diamondback Explorer also came with this update. Drones were also introduced, finally allowing players to collect mining materials and cargo without having to manually scoop them. Version 1.4 was the next update, and it pretty much surprised everyone, and really not in a good way. It was the CQC update also known as Close Quarters Championships. This was initially released as a game launch separately from the Elite launcher. 3 more ships also arrived, and well, now the reason people were so surprised with the CQC update was the fact that it was a separate game. It's one of the reasons that to this day it isn't widely played. Bottom line, whilst it is an enjoyable experience, it didn't add anything to the Elite Dangerous Galaxy. So this summed up the first year of releases. Community goals, Wings and CQC. There are also a huge number of fixes and quality of life updates, but at this point, however, already within the community there were rumblings that the gameplay loops hadn't really changed all that much. But then came the release of Horizons in December of 2015, just 1 year after the game's release. This included the 1.5 update ships for those without Horizons, but the headline feature was undoubtedly planetary landings. This allowed players for the first time to land on atmospheric-less worlds. It was a huge change and easily my personal favourite update. A bunch of the new mission types were also added along with a variety of other changes. At this point, many players expected the Horizon season to last for 1 year, and this made sense because the first major update arrived exactly 1 year after the game's release. It was also called a season, and many people interpreted this to mean 1 year. Frontier again did nothing to dispel this notion. Ultimately, Horizons lasted for around 2 years. In that time, in addition to planetary landings, other massive updates occurred that changed the nature of the game. Primary among these was the release of the Engineers. This gave players the ability to modify their ship's modules via an extensive list of upgrades. However, upon release it was widely felt to be too grindy and far too random. These are concerns that Frontier addressed over later years. Now, whether or not you were a fan of the Engineers, they did add a lot to the game. The ability to build many variations of ships is something that is a key feature of Elite Dangerous to this day. The Guardians update introduced ship-launched fighters as well as the first discovery of Guardian archaeological sites and the associated puzzles. Voice training scenarios were also added. In fact, the Guardians was a massive update with new galaxy filters, the introduction of new installations, weapon and module storage and transfer, ship transfer and remote setting, new graphics, and the FSD boost from neutron stars, to name a few things. The Commanders update in April of 2017 brought with it player avatars with customization, NPC portraits, a new fully functional camera suite, ship naming, asteroid space stations, megaships, multi-stage missions, and a good number of other things besides. The final update for Horizons released in September of 2017, nearly 2 years after the season's initial launch. It was a relatively small affair, but brought with it Thargoid combat, which has become a nice staple addition to the game. The Horizon season also introduced Thargoid bases and a number of other mysteries and puzzles. By the end of Horizons, it becomes difficult to start pushing the idea that Elite Dangerous hasn't really changed. For sure, it still relied on the same fundamental gameplay loops of flying a ship and moving things from A to B or shooting NPCs or players, but the galaxy itself had massively been updated with vast amounts of additions. Now, I hesitate to use the word content here because people have their own definition of what that means, and some people, perhaps on the more fanatical side, get a little frothy at the mouth at precisely what content should and should not be. But bottom line, at the end of 2017, Elite was in a very different place to the launch in 2014. The Beyond update ran throughout 2018 and initially felt very much like a slow delivery of minor updates. It started out well enough with Chapter 1, new planetary graphics, new ships, some wing missions. Yes, 1.5 years after the arrival of wing missions finally arrived. Debatable improved trade-in, along with crime and punishment changes. The update also contained a much-needed revamp of engineering, along with tech brokers that introduced a new way to obtain ship modules and weapons. A number of other changes, such as megaship interactions, also came along. Chapter 2 and 3 introduced more ships, along with some new Guardian mysteries and a variety of new tech. Whilst they included a good number of features, the updates were nonetheless small and lacked the punch of previous updates. Chapter 4, however, was a substantial update. New graphics in the form of improved lighting and entirely new exploration system and mining mechanics, squadrons, new ships, a new way to discover unidentified signal sources, as well as a variety of scenarios. Chapter 4 then, for me personally, made Elite finally feel that it was a fully fleshed out game. Now, As we sit here in 2019 and look back at all these updates, it's certainly disingenuous to say that Elite hasn't changed since 2014. That is blatantly and demonstratively false. However, yes, the game is still built upon that same foundation of flying from A to B, that foundation of collecting or shooting X amount of XYZ. Ultimately, I suspect that this will never change. And I also suspect that some people would feel that this foundational gameplay loop is somewhat flawed, and to an extent I agree with a few parts of it. I've never said Elite Dangerous was perfect. I've got my many issues with it. And like I say, I suspect those things will never really change. But you can't really say that the game hasn't come a long way. It's made some dramatic improvements over the years. In either regards, whatever we have to say about the game, the big question right now is, what does it all mean for the future? What beyond, in addition to introducing a number of other things, introduced things that we could perhaps call content building tools? That is to say, it introduced scenarios, the codex, exploration mechanics and new sensors, plus a number of other things. Now all of these could be used by Frontier to very quickly introduce new elements into the game. How they decide to use these is anyone's guess, but it would make sense that these tools are key for the upcoming events that are being introduced throughout 2019. It suggests a curated form of gameplay in a massive procedural game world. I'm interested in seeing where this is going, and I suspect I'm among many players in hoping that it will be enough. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys and girls next time.